Welcome to Rekindled Faith with Melanie Bearda. Whether you've been wrestling with questions, facing doubt, or simply just uninspired, let's dive into what it means to be authentic followers of Christ. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to this week's episode of Rekindled Faith. My name is Melanie Bearda, and I get the honor and privilege of being your host. Today, we have with us Dr. Andy Bannister. Andy is the director of Solas and a highly in-demand speaker, writer, and broadcaster. He has written multiple books and most recently has co-edited and contributed to the book Have You Ever Wondered, which we do dive into during this conversation. So join me in welcoming Dr. Andy Bannister. Andy, welcome here.
It's great to be with you on the podcast, Melanie. Thanks for inviting me to be with you.
Yeah. It's it's an honor to have you here. I've heard of you through Apologetics Canada. You have spoken at their conferences. You are good friends with the head guy, Dr. Andy Steiger.
Steiger the Tiger, that's what I call him.
Oh, lovely. Lovely. I'll try that one next time I see him.
Do you know, if you try that, Melanie, he will say, "You've been talking to Andy Bannister." Yeah. He will know instantly.
He'll know. That's awesome. Wonderful. Well, yeah, thanks so much for being here. If you don't mind, for the listeners that maybe don't know who you are or what you're all about, could you just do a little intro on yourself?
That assumes I know what I'm all about, Melanie. So my backstory is, personally born in the UK, born in London, grew up there, and then sort of moved slowly out of London and then came over to Canada actually in 2010. Where I first got into doing similar kind of work to what you guys do at Apologetics Canada, helping people think about the big questions of life and faith in Jesus. I've always loved the big questions. I've always loved engaging people who've got questions. And so I had a wonderful opportunity to come do that in Canada for 6 years, then came back to the UK, and we're doing it for 9 years over here. So I'm a Christian writer, speaker, broadcaster, and we're not doing those kind of things. Married, 2 small children, well, medium-sized children, and I climb mountains and try not to fall off them.
That's wonderful. I also climb mountains and try not to fall off of them.
It's very good. Those 2 things often are important to put together. I think that's just,
They truly are.
Yeah.
In the context of rock climbing, that rope sure makes a difference, though.
Oh, you see, well, yeah, that's another conversation. See, I'm more of a, up to 45, 50 degrees scramble. My daughter, though, my 12-year-old, is a mad keen kind of rock climber. I stupidly showed her Free Solo and Alex Honnold, and now, she is off. So I have a rock climber in the family.
That's awesome. Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks for that intro. And I know that you've authored a number of books, and the one most recently was like a co-authoring of Have You Ever Wondered? I have not read it, but I've heard good things about it. And so do you just want to kind of jump into a little bit of what that book is about?
Yeah, well, actually, since then, the storyline shifted because there's actually another book since then. But just as of 2 weeks ago. But Have You Ever Wondered? So Have You Ever Wondered came out of we ran a series of articles on the website for the organisation I lead. I lead an organisation in the UK called Solas. Solas is the Gaelic word for light, and we love that image of the kind of light of who Jesus is, kind of spreading across and illuminating shadows and interesting corners and so on. And we ran a series on the Solas website a couple of years ago called Have You Ever Wondered, where we took topics and themes that most people are passionate about but haven't stopped and wondered where those things come from. So let me give you an example. Justice is a good example. Most people listening to this podcast, I hope, care about justice. We get upset when we read of human rights abuses, whether it happens to us or if we, see what's going on in the news, whether it's Israel and Gaza, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's just stuff happening locally. We get upset and angry when human beings are abused. But why? It's a really interesting question to say, have you ever wondered why? After all, if there is no God, we are just another animal that got, in our case, perhaps a little bit luckier in the evolutionary lottery, but we have no special value at all. We have no more value than an ant amoeba, an aardvark, a lettuce, and so on. Those things don't have kind of, immutable rights. What on earth makes us think we have them? That becomes a really curious question. And then there are others. Why does beauty move us if the only point of life is reproductive success, reproductive fitness? Why does a beautiful piece of music or a lovely landscape view or a mountain summit and a sunset move us? What is going on there? And actually, it turns out there are dozens of these kinds of questions. So we did this website series over a year, and then a very well-known publisher in the UK approached us and went, "You guys need to turn this into a book." So we did. So we turned it into Have You Ever Wondered, that came out last year, and since then it's gone through about 30,000 copies in a year, which for a book of this type is actually really quite unusual. And we've been so encouraged, Melanie, by the stories we hear of two types of people. One is people who've got a Christian faith giving it to friends and finding it really welcome. Because sometimes Christian books can be a bit sort of blatant and going through the front door with both boots, rather than going, "Hey, have you thought about?" And Have You Ever Wondered is designed to start conversations gently. And then the other one are people who are exploring faith or wrestling with faith or struggling with faith, who found it a really interesting, different way to think about Jesus and the Christian faith. And for many, it's been a light bulb moment in realizing, oh my word, Christian faith isn't just about me and God and heaven and those kind of things. It affects all the things I care the most about. And so the goal of the book really is to say, yes, that's right. So come on home, because actually Christian faith makes sense of the things that you've already figured out. But at the minute, they're just clues. The Christian faith puts the clues together, or the jigsaw pieces together, into the bigger story. So that's Have You Ever Wondered?
That's beautiful. You're speaking my language. I love it. I just I have such a heart and such a desire to be able to kind of like pull back the curtain, because for myself, I've already mentioned this to my listeners and also to you, but I grew up in Christian faith, so I knew the jargon, I knew the talk, I knew the language, but at the heart of it, I didn't have salvation. I didn't understand salvation. And so ultimately I struggled in a few different areas and I ended up walking away from faith.
Yeah.
The jargon sometimes can be a total turnoff. I've shared this before, I think, on my social media. Even saying Jesus loves you to some person that hasn't experienced the love of Jesus, it doesn't hit home. It doesn't make sense. It's just like, who is this Jesus guy? Why are you even saying that? Stop trying to control me or whatever. The most well-intentioned words or way that we can talk as Christians to non-believers or those that have walked away from faith, it can actually be more of a salt in the wound than it can be something that is life-giving and life-forming. And so I like just listening to you explain that book and everything, even with the access that it has for those that maybe are not Christians, but do have questions about faith, but have been bombarded online with all of the us versus them culture that can happen.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with all of that. And I in my case, I never walked away from faith. I had the real privilege of growing up in a Christian home and going to church as a teenager, loving it. Took me till my mid-teens to work out I had to do something about it myself. Probably until my mid-teens, it was my mum and dad's faith, not my faith. And that was a sort of road bump to realize, oh, I've got to think about this for whether it's real and true for myself. I can't just hang on to their coattails. But then I think probably in my early 20s, not quite a crisis, but I think I really wrestled with the fact that Christian faith felt very kind of shallow and almost boring. I remember sort of thinking about, well, the Christian faith seems to say that, if I put my faith in Jesus, I get this ticket to heaven. Well, I'm 20. Hopefully I won't die till I'm really old, like, my mid-30s or something. I just picked on that because, like you told me earlier, how old you are. When you're 20, you think mid-30s is forever. But I thought that was it. I thought my job is to hold on to this golden ticket until I die, and then I get to go to heaven to be with Jesus. But between now and then, what the hell am I supposed to do? In fact, I remember thinking the best thing to do would be get flattened by a bus, because I just need to get up there, because that's what life's about. And then it was in my early 20s coming across, some really great writers, really great friends who thought these things through, who'd helped me begin to explore, I suppose, what was now, I would call the wandering stuff, of realizing, oh no, wait a minute. The Christian faith has something to say about justice and art and the environment and mathematics and science and I think that can be a real transformative moment for a Christian, even there's nothing wrong with their faith. Their faith just needs broadening a bit. But then when that happens, it becomes so much easier to talk to others who are in different places. Because, I absolutely think Jesus is the best news ever. But I totally get if I walk up to a random stranger and start there, they're going to think I'm a nutter at best. Whereas if I can gently say, well, tell me the things that you care about. What matters the most to you? What do you get out of bed in the morning for? What do you get angry about or passionate about? Let's start there, and we'll have a conversation, see where we are. And I bet there are some threads that lead in interesting places. And by the way, for Christians listening to this, because I know you've got a really wide-ranging audience, Melanie, this is what Paul does in Acts 17 in the New Testament, where back in the first century, Paul, early follower of Jesus, interesting story to faith himself. He went from being a persecutor of the early church and killing and murdering Christians to being a follower of Jesus. He goes there to Athens, and he's wandering around Athens and trying to figure out how he can talk about Jesus to this very utterly different culture. And then he comes across this altar that the Athenians have erected to an unknown god. And he starts there. He basically preaches a little sermon based upon, have you ever wondered what you're doing with this altar? What is this unknown God that you're talking about? Let me tell you who that is. And it's a really clever model in how you can start from where somebody already is on their faith journey and just show them, actually, maybe Jesus makes sense of what's already going on here. So, come on home.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Just as you're talking, I think about it's not about winning the argument. I read Frank Turek's book Tactics about putting a pebble in the shoe, of asking questions and just engaging in that relationship. And I found, even with me now being more open with my faith within like real life, because I used to, like, honestly, I call it my hibernation time of when I came back to faith in Christ. I really had to dive into what it meant to be a Christian, why I wanted to be a Christian, who is Jesus, why do I care for Jesus, why does Jesus care for me, wrestling through a lot of those questions and trying to navigate through. And then, so now I'm obviously more public about my belief, and it's been a growing experience. Like, even in my daily life with the people that I'm around, I'm an active member within my own community, volunteering with search and rescue, TEDx events, those types of things, where I am surrounded by people with very, very different viewpoints and ideas and worldviews and all that. And just being able to like engage in relationship with them and ask them questions and why do you believe what you believe. It's just been a real honest gift and treasure to be able to have those conversations. And I think sometimes as Christians, we can think that we need to have all our ducks in a row before we can ask those questions, or we need to fully understand things before we can ask those questions. And I think that keeps a lot of us into that hibernation zone of not really believing that we have the ability to evangelize because we're not the Billy Grahams of the world, but kind of coming to that process of accepting, like, this is what I believe. And sometimes the questions that we are given back by people that maybe are skeptical or believe something different can also allow us to wrestle with something that can deepen our faith in what we believe. That's been my experience.
I mean, so many things there I could respond to. I think straight away, as you say, the point where you ended there, I think for a lot of Christians feel I love the way that, your ducks in the row, have it all figured out, which none of us have it all figured out. I mean, even if you've been a Christian 60 years, you haven't got it all figured out. You might have more figured out than others. But the danger is then you almost make Christianity into an argument. You're trying to sort of, somehow do, I don't know, sort of intellectual jujitsu on somebody. And the danger there is, I mean, firstly, you run the risk of losing the person even if you win the argument. Secondly, if it's all, trying to persuade somebody by sheer force of argument that there's a God, I'm not sure we can do that. As Christians, we should believe that the God's Spirit has a very significant role in working in someone's heart and mind and so forth. But then also, there's that lovely line in the book of James in the New Testament where James, the brother of Jesus, the author of that, and he was interesting. He was a skeptic during Jesus' lifetime. He didn't believe his own brother until the resurrection happened. There's a line there where he says, even the demons believe in God and tremble. So it's not about just persuading someone there's a God and having them go, okay, I admit it, there's a God. Christian faith is far much more than that. So I think reorientating yourself around that helps. And then secondly, one thing I was struck by, I've just come off a 3-month trip across the USA and Canada, which is a lovely time reconnecting with old friends and family and whatnot over there. I was struck by there's similar things going on in Canadian and American culture than there are in the UK culture right now. That you've got a lot of people, I think, who would definitely say, I'm not religious. If you start with a religion word, the barriers go up. But if you say things like, would you consider yourself a spiritual person? Are you interested in the big questions of life? That kind of language, people warm up. They go, oh, actually, yeah, definitely. And then when you ask follow-up questions, well, tell me, how's that working for you? What are you thinking? And as you're doing that, to be listening and praying as a Christian and looking for opportunities where you can say, this is really interesting. Have you considered, or what do you mean by? And the more you take the time to do that, the more I then find, Melanie, it's very natural then to say, well, this is interesting. By the way, I'm a follower of Jesus. And, my experience has been, now, there is going to come a point where you need to have discussion and debate because, truth is truth. But it'd be a surprise that way you don't always have to start there. Start by building the friendship. Start by listening. Start by poking a little bit. Start by asking questions, which, by the way, is what Jesus did. Jesus asked 307 questions in the Gospels. So if questions were good enough for him, they should be good enough for us, at least as a starting point.
Absolutely. I also think like sometimes we can rush things. Like we're worried or we're scattered and like, oh no, like I need to get my point across. I need to like tell the truth and, bring this person to Christ. And I think like Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite books because it's just like everything under the sun has come and been done. Like God knows he's been through
Yeah.
this multiple times. I even read the Old Testament. Some people are like, oh, it's so boring and not relevant.
No, no, no,
But I
no,
read it
no.
and I'm like, no, 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 the human condition has not changed. Like the people back in the Old Testament were scared. They didn't want to do what God was asking them to do. They were, skeptical, or they were even, some of them were standing firm in the truth of what they believed to be true. And while people would come out after them and try to like take them down and all that stuff, and they would stand true. Like I think of Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, and well, specifically Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego when they
Yes.
went into the fire. And like they're like, no, like we're not going to serve your gods because we believe that our God is the true God. This is Melanie's version, okay? So
Well,
not
yeah, and the
quoted.
other part as well, Melanie. I love that story because you missed the stinger in the tail. I love the bit when they add also, and when we believe our God will rescue us. And by the way, even if he chooses not
Yeah,
to the king of Babylon or wherever, we're still not going to do what you're telling us to do, buddy.
yeah,
So just like jog on. That's the
totally.
original Hebrew. Jog on. There.
Jog on. I love it. That's great. Yeah, so I don't know. Like Christianity, like we're talking about it too. Like you used to think that it was kind of shallow and then you had to go through some processes, ask some questions, go through some things to recognize it is quite rich and it is relatable today. When I read the Bible, I do relate to like it helps me, it equips me, it allows me to recognize that God has gone through these things before with people of previous generations. And I think sometimes we can forget history. We can
Oh
forget
yeah.
how people have reacted or responded in the past. And so as I get older, I'm becoming, well, I don't know, interested in all like the what I would have called as a teenager boring topics.
Oh, there are no boring topics. There are
No.
boring people. You can bore about any topic you like, but well, actually, maybe there are boring topics. There is an internet. There is a global electricity pile-on appreciation society. That probably is boring, but most things aren't boring. And history, by the way, you're right, because I think one of the things we can forget. This is not just Christians who do this, by the way. I think we live in a very ahistorical age where we like to think that the things that we're going through in our time are unique. I really, by the way, woke up to that during COVID when we were behaving in particularly in the Western world as if we were the first civilization ever to experience some kind of pandemic. And you're like, hang on a minute, these things come along every 50 years. Human beings have been experiencing this kind of stuff since recorded history began. Doesn't mean it's not painful, but maybe we could look to how people in the past have thought about this, and maybe there's some wisdom there. And then when it comes to Christianity and spiritual questions, as Christians, we have the beauty of 2,000 years of lived experience of Christian women and men. Sometimes they're like us, sometimes not like us, in different contexts, different cultures, different experiences, and to learn from them and to watch how they've wrestled through. And I think the more you dig into that, the more that you see that some of the people we would perhaps consider giants of faith today in the past, yeah, they had questions, they had challenges, they had difficulties. So we're not alone in that. So therefore, we shouldn't be surprised. But I think sometimes we like shortcuts. So in the church, we like to shortcut. We like to, we end up constructing easy, simplistic answers. And I understand why people who are wrestling with faith therefore get frustrated. But equally, outside the church, you look at, I mean, it's over now, but say the new atheism movement, that sort of cluttered up the landscape for, much of the last 20 years. Again, really shallow answers, desperately, woefully shallow answers. So I think one of the challenges is we live in an age, particularly with social media and the like, where it can be very tempting to look for answers that may sound lovely when you first hear them, but have no depth at all. And trying to build your life on those, I suppose, is like doing nothing more than eating candy. Yeah, so it's be lovely for the first 2 or 3 mouthfuls because we're wired to respond to sugar, but very quickly we're going to struggle. And the same can happen spiritually and existentially, I think, unless we really are willing to ask the deep questions.
Yeah, I just think of like instant gratification that we have now in this like consumerism culture of getting what we want when we want, Amazon delivery, Prime, let's go. Everything's like instant. And so I think that humanity struggles to appreciate the time that we have to spend kind of in the waiting, you know, whether it's like waiting at the doctor's office, people are on their phones, you know, and when God asks us to wait and doesn't give us the full outline of what the game plan is for life, we have to wait. We have to like wrestle in that experience of waiting on God
Mm.
and waiting on what is to come next. And it's interesting because I'm a parent, I'm a mom. And so now trying to teach my kids about that and how, you know what, life is about waiting because they don't want to wait for things. They want it now. And, but like literally, you go to the doctor's office, you sit, you wait. You go in the lineup at Costco, you sit, you wait. Like most of our lives, I would say, is waiting for something. So what are we going to do with that time of waiting? And spiritually speaking, for myself, I've wrestled with waiting like in the ministry aspect because I had, well, I wasn't going to do this. I wasn't going to be a podcaster. I wasn't going to be online talking to people about Jesus and whatever it is that I'm doing. But all of a sudden I'm in this lane and I'm like, okay, how do I do this? What did I do? Is this working? And that waiting game of trying to figure out, like, is this God's will? I feel like I am on the right path, but why can't I see the other side?
Yeah, I mean, we're not. I think we're not. You're right. We're not. No, I was about to say we're not good at waiting as human beings. We've become not good at waiting.
Yeah.
And in fact, actually, for anyone listening to this, you know, who's sitting there thinking, "Hey, I'm good at waiting," little exercise for you. Next time you're in the supermarket, pick the longest line, not the shortest,
Oh,
and
yeah.
keep your phone in your pocket until you get to the cashier to pay, and see if your blood pressure is the same by the time you get to the end of that experience, because it will very quickly make you realize I'm not good at waiting. I know
Yeah.
because I've tried it. 'Cause someone challenged me to do it, and it was like didn't end well. And the other thing as well, I think the shortcut piece flows into it as well because we live in this age of AI, where that's the new emerging technology, and it's very exciting. And I'm in the midst of researching a book on it and so on, and we love playing around with this stuff, don't we? But the danger is again you shortcut because it's much simpler to fire up Grok or ChatGPT or whatever and just ask your question. And people are asking AIs questions about spiritual things. This is astonishing when you dig into this. People are literally asking Grok, is there a God and what should I do? And it's like, Grok is good at many, many things, and ChatGPT is good at many, many things, but answering those kind of questions for you, that's going to take time and effort and stuff. But again, I always come back to Jesus in this. I love the fact that Jesus said, the one who seeks will find, knock and ask and you will receive, knock and the door will be opened unto you. But the idea of the seeking and the finding and it being hard, I think for some people that's a strange thing to get their head around. Christians, I think we can end up thinking it should all be on a plate for us. And for people listening to this, perhaps who are wrestling with faith or hang on to faith by their fingernails, again, you can similarly fall into, well, it shouldn't be tough. It should be easy. Maybe God's like, actually, no, because I want you to discover something
Yeah.
through the journey, because that which is hard won, you're going to treasure much, much more. And maybe actually, sometimes we learn as much in the journey as we do in the destination.
Yeah. That makes me think of that quote. It's not about the destination, it's about the journey.
I realized I was sounding
Right?
like a motivational poster with that. Actually,
We should get some cups printed.
yeah.
Yeah, totally. Man, and like in my own experience, it's like in that waiting is where I feel fulfilled. It's not in the things that I've achieved. It's in that waiting with Christ of like I call it like even being in the wilderness, like the spiritual wilderness of just waiting and holding space with God and learning how to be present in that space because I can definitely rush things and try to cut those corners and try to like get to the finish line quicker because I think that I need to do those things in order to be achieving
Hmm.
things. But what a gift it is to be just present in day-to-day life with Christ and to know how to have that waiting, like just not I guess not be fearful of that waiting.
I think so, and I think we've done. There's been great damage done sometimes, Melanie, as well, both inside the church and outside the church. We're not talking enough about what as Christians we would call discipleship. I know that's that's a sort of jargon word. So I'm conscious of people listening to this who are from outside the Christian community going, what does that mean? Well, basically, earlier on, I talked about the fact that mistake I drifted to into my 20s of thinking that being a Christian was you say sorry to God, but you trust in Jesus, you get a golden ticket, and then we don't talk about the next 70 years, and then you get flattened by the bus and go to heaven. But actually, then you suddenly realize when you read the New Testament and what Jesus talks about and the other writers of the New Testament talk about, okay, that's not it at all. That's how it begins. Christian faith begins when you put your trust in Jesus and say, okay, Jesus, you're Lord. I've screwed up. Can you forgive the stuff that I've made a mess of? Adopt me into your family as a son or a daughter. But then it's inviting Jesus on a daily basis into that process of reshaping you and remolding you and remaking you. It's almost like, we're a sort of sculpture and Jesus is Michelangelo slowly knocking bits off over a 75-year or 80-year process. And I'm sure actually if you could ask the block of marble that, Michelangelo is working on to make the statue of David, do you want to have bits knocked off you? It would probably have gone, no, that's actually very painful. But the end process was a beautiful work of art. And God loves us so much. He doesn't want us to remain as we are, but he wants us to make us as more and more and more into the image of Christ. And when you get your head around that, you go, oh my word, now the Christian faith is a lifelong journey, and it's going to have ups and it's going to have downs, and it's going to be times when it's tough. One of my favorite Christian writers, C.S. Lewis, talks about the fact that when you become a Christian, it's like you've invited God into your house as a guest. And, you had the idea that maybe he was going to redecorate a couple of things, perhaps repaint the hallway and rehang a door. And suddenly there's crashing and banging and drilling because he's remodeling the entire house. And it's much more drastic than you ever realized. But that's because he's got a much bigger vision than you ever realized. And when you get your head around that, you're like, oh my word. You suddenly have a fresh appreciation for how much God loves us, because it's not just about, I think you used the word salvation earlier, it's not just about that. That's a massive part of it, yes, but it's also about God entirely remaking us such that everything that is bad and sad eventually becomes undone, and all the things that we struggle and wrestle with, eventually we struggle and wrestle with no more. And as the Bible promises, one day there will be no more tears, because God will have dealt with it all.
Yes, that redemption process of I think about, you're talking about chiseling away, and I'm thinking about pruning back the hedges or the bushes to bring about a better bush, a better tree. I do that in my yard. I cut back the branches, and then in the springtime, it's all happy again. And I again, from my own experience too, God has asked me to surrender various parts of my life or things that I would have thought were part of my identity in order to give me something better. And it's not a comfortable process. It's not something that feels good to me. It is painful. I've had to grieve different ideas of how I wanted my life to be. But I can tell you now at age 36, married with 2 kids, stay-at-home mom, baking sourdough bread and making my own jelly. This was not my plan, Andy.
Wow.
This was not my plan. I was like a career-focused person, and I'm not speaking poorly against women that choose to have a career and all that stuff. So please, people, don't read it in between the lines. But
I can see the phone lines lighting up right now.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm in this space where I never ever even considered this as being the option for my life. And every day I wake up filled with gratitude. And every day I thank God for the gift of this beautiful life that I get to live. I have a wholesome marriage with a wonderful man and 2 beautiful children. And you know what? I have a cat too, and that cat brings me joy. But my point is that sometimes God has to remove the things that we think we need in order to give us something that he's designed for us. And I think that we miss that in culture, in life. We expect that, I've worked hard to bring up this identity piece, but at the end of the day, what happens when those things are taken from you? If I lose my job, if I lose some member of my family, if I lose, even for me, search and rescue, if I stop volunteering for search and rescue, who am I? What am I? Is that part of my identity, or is it just something that I get the privilege of doing?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. There's a quote I often use when I do talks on this. He's been dead for a few years now, but there was a Pulitzer Prize nominated novelist called David Foster Wallace, who in a commencement address he gave, I think at Stanford University, and as far as we know, he wasn't a Christian. He says to this group of students, he says, the day-to-day trenches of everyday life, there is no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. And any choice you get is what to worship. And a very good reason for worshipping some sort of god or spiritual type thing, he says, is that pretty much everything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and power, Well, you'll never have enough of those things, and that will haunt you and tear you up. If you worship your image, then you will, live in constant fear of the day that you lose that. If you worship power, you need more power over others, and so on. And I think what he was onto in that speech that he gave in his book, "This Is Water," you can read that address. He's onto the fact that, just as you've described, as human beings, we are made to be worshippers. You can't escape that. If you're an atheist listening to this, you can say, "Oh, I don't believe in God." Okay, fine, but you'll end up worshipping something, in that you'll make something central. And the problem is, then you become like an addict. You talked about addiction earlier. You have to have it, whether it's that job or that search and rescue thing or the family status or whatever it is. And then, firstly, that thing then ends up controlling you. Secondly, you end up being a nightmare around others because you feel that you need to cling on to it. And then ultimately, it's going to hurt you and you're going to hurt it, and the whole thing ends in tears. And I think one of the beautiful things about the Christian faith is that it reorientates things correctly. Very, very old Christian thinker and philosopher called St. Augustine, 1700 years ago, diagnosed. He said, the basic problem with human beings is our loves are disordered. We've been taught in so many ways to love the wrong thing, and that goes wrong for us in so many ways. And what the Christian faith does, what Jesus wants to do, is reorientate those loves. And the important things there is that Jesus never takes away something you love without giving you something better. But also, when you put Jesus in his place, those other things fall into place. There's nothing wrong with loving search and rescue, or loving your job, or loving your family, or loving your career, whatever it is. But if it's once it no longer becomes the ultimate thing, then it becomes just something you can rejoice in and celebrate and enjoy and thank God for, rather than a thing you've got to cling on to with your fingernails going white, because if I lose this, my life isn't worth living. And so a lot of Christian faith taken seriously, I think, Augustine had it 1700 years ago. It's about getting our loves orientated correctly, and that's what Jesus wants to do for us, among all the other things.
That's great. And it kind of circles back to the part of the conversation where we talked about history and how the human condition really hasn't changed. And, I've heard it said before, like we have a God-shaped hole in our heart, and we just try to fill that with other things because we don't know how to get God in there. Or maybe some people just don't want God in there because they have already preconceived ideas of what it means. And like you mentioned earlier too, like religion versus spirituality. So
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those things are true. I mean, it's certainly the case, isn't it, that I think also when we chase God out, either as individuals or as society, as it were, the gods come marching in, and what you end up doing is divinizing other things. And many people have written, and not just Christians, by the way, on the fact that some of the deepest culture war issues in our society have happened because people have basically divinized other things. So you look at some of the toxic stuff, around discussions of sexuality or transgender or stuff. And that's without taking any sides in that discussion. Just look at the way that those discussions happen, with great entrenched positions and people firing weaponry at each other on the internet. Well, it's because this is identity, and sexuality has become a religion. Or ecology, which is an issue that matters huge amounts to me. But actually, it's become almost now a faux religion, in that if you question things or you frame things differently, or you don't share someone's exact understanding of a particular issue, even within the green community, we have these horrific tribes now sort of aligned against each other, all because, again, people have done the same thing. And I think it turns out the conclusion in all of this is that human beings are just wired to be religious. We are wired deeply to be religious, which leads to one or two conclusions, in my view, Melanie. Either evolution has played a very cruel trick on us, if there is no God. It's almost like, Mother Darwin has decided, for a practical joke, to crosswire human beings and have them pursue things and give transcendent values to things and divinize things when there's nothing going on. And that's odd why evolution would waste all that energy. Or it's a massive, great big clue that there is a bigger story out there. And you know what? Maybe it's going to take a little bit of effort to figure out what is true when it comes to that big story. And I'm often saying that to sort of friends who are thinking about these things. I'm saying, I always say as a Christian, don't just take my word for it with Jesus. Go and check Jesus out, but by all means, go and look at the alternatives. Because actually, I think when you compare Jesus with the alternatives, he stands head and shoulders above the others. But by all means, don't look at the alternatives. Don't go and seriously look at these things. Seek, and you will find, as Jesus said.
Yeah, and I think that's the gift of living this life is that we get to ask those questions. We get to continue to seek, and it doesn't have to happen overnight. We don't have to rush it like we talked about. We can be present in that waiting, in that questioning, in that wondering and thinking about things and asking other people and all that stuff, but also taking it back to Christ and like pursuing Christ in the midst of it. Like you've said, like seek and you shall find. Um, and I just think that's beautiful about Christianity and the fact that we don't have to be fearful of asking questions from other religious bodies. What does Islam say? What does Sikh say? Like different things, even New Age practices. I've recognized there's a lot of New Age practices happening within my community and within my friend group, even just various people within my community that are engaging in crystals and all those things. And so like asking questions about it and not being afraid of it. And I think when I was being brought up, I was taught to fear things that were not Christianity. Like it was everything out there was really bad. Don't even talk to it. Don't look at it. It's bad. Just don't. And I think for myself in getting into apologetics, becoming interested in it and theology. And I've just registered to start going to Bible college for biblical studies and stuff. And it's like I get permission to ask these questions and to wrestle with some things and try to navigate through,
Yeah.
listen to what other people have to say about things. And like I get to determine what is, not I don't want to say like I'm determining what's true, but I get to like place it on the Bible. Like what does the Bible say? What does God say? What does scripture say? What is Christian truth versus what's leaking into the body of
Hmm.
Christ?
Yeah, I'd agree with a lot of that. There's a couple of mistakes I think people make about truth. One is the idea that, well, anything is truth, or all truth is the same, or there is no such thing as truth. I mean, that's, as a philosopher, what we would call, relativism or postmodernism. And it's devastating, actually, because you end up with nowhere to stand. And by the way, back to where we started at the beginning, you don't just lose the ability to talk about God, you lose the ability to talk about justice. Because how can you call anything out for an injustice if there is no such thing as truth and everything's your own opinions? But the other mistake is to go, okay, well, as a Christian, I believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Therefore, I'm going to yell at other people. I'm going to weaponize truth. I'm going to clobber them around the head. I'm just going to be really, really brutal in the way I approach things. That is also a mistake. Firstly, because I think it actually comes from fear. It comes from actually fear of, oh gosh, maybe if I was a little bit more generous to people who are different to me, maybe it would turn out my faith is not as strong as I thought it was. There can be a fear there at times, and fear triggers the fight or flight reaction. Um, the other mistake it can make, I think, is realizing that we don't tend to win people kind of that way. And back to Paul in Athens, I love the fact that at the beginning of that passage in Acts 17, we're told Paul walks around Athens and he sees all these idols and these statues and all this pagan polytheistic paraphernalia. And before he was a Christian, he was a Jew. He was a Pharisee. He was a very Jewish Jew. So he'd have been trained by his Old Testament, his upbringing, to hate polytheism. So you'd expect him, as you read that story for the first time, you'd expect him to go down there to the Areopagus, stand up, do his sermon, and just lay into the Athenians, right, for their foolishness. But he doesn't. He starts by saying, I was amazed how religious you were. I was impressed when I looked at all of your statues. He basically praises them for their religiosity. But then he gently leads but then I saw this altar to an unknown God and I got wandering. And I think there's something for Christians, I think, in leading that way of going, yeah. So if your friend is into crystals or whatever it is, of going, you have to sit there and affirm it, but you could sit there and go, that's really interesting. Where did that come from? How did you come across that? And what's going on there? And, ask questions. And if there are obvious inconsistencies, don't be afraid of saying, okay, help me out. What you mean by that? And the more you do that, the more you've created a platform where you can say, well, this is really interesting. As a Christian, I believe something different, and share your faith and see what happens.
Yeah. And I've had some really great conversations by just doing that. Like just sitting down with people and asking them and not persecuting them for not believing what I believe, but like, why do you believe that? And I think a lot of times, even myself, if people have asked me questions and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I don't really have an answer. I just, like we just have these ideas of this is what I believe. And then we never really look into the meat and potatoes of that belief. And so it offers up an opportunity for us too to recognize, okay, well, maybe I need to look into that a little bit more and better understand where I sit with that.
I think so, and I think the nice thing about this approach too, as well, Melanie, you're right. It pings back on Christians because we're commended in the Bible. First Peter 3:15, one of the letters written by Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples. That very famous passage, or certainly famous for folks like you and I who are into big questions and so on, where Peter says, "Always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that you have." I mean, that's a real challenge to us as Christians because I wonder how many of us do actually are able to give a reason for the hope that we have. Say, well, I'm a Christian because I was raised in the church, or I'm a Christian because I had some amazing experience when I was 23 on a desert island or something. But then when a friend says to you, well, but hang on, why do you believe? We go a bit stum and we can't say anything. And I think it's a good challenge to go, that's not biblical faith. We don't all have to be geniuses and PhDs. But Peter is saying, no, I think every one of you needs to be able to, when someone says, why do you have this hope in Christ? That we need to be able to give some kind of answer. And by the way, that means if you're listening to this show and you wouldn't call yourself a Christian, the next Christian you come to, you have my and Melanie's permission to poke them and say, you're a Christian. Why? And if they can't
Yeah.
tell you, you could say, hey, your Bible says you ought to be able to tell me. I want
Yes,
to
there you
know.
go.
I don't just
Cool.
expect an intellectual answer, but I would like to know why you have the faith that you do.
Yeah. And I think it's something that us Christians need to not fear, to be asked why we believe. And I think that for some of us, like I know I always talk about my own experience because, well, I've lived it, but I know for me early on in my days, like if you would have asked me why I'm a Christian, like I would have told, because I recovered from alcoholism. So that was the original, I guess, prompt for me to
Hmm.
come back to faith and to like rediscover who God is and everything. But, that would have kind of like thrown me off. Like, I don't know what to say right now. So I think that it's good. We even come back to that pruning process or that chiseling process of when we're asked questions as Christians of what we believe and why we believe it. It creates an opportunity for God to be able to kind of prune back the areas and help redefine, not redefine, but refine what we are, who we are, and why we are Christians.
I think so. And I think also it may be that when a friend asks you that question and you answer it, it may be a surprise for them, because I think both Christians can have misconceptions of non-Christians. We can assume all of our friends who don't share our faith are atheist or skeptical for whatever reason, and it may turn out there are different reasons. And conversely, outside the Christian community, I think people can assume all people are Christians for insert reason. There's one of the I did a lot of work over the years on the new atheism, and a lot of the new atheists and people aligned with that movement were sort of under the impression that Christians were people who just children who never grown up. And I used to sort of when doing sort of talks on university campuses around that time would often say if you do a survey of an average church, and I've done this on numerous occasions, you'd be amazed how many Christians don't come to faith until they're in their late teens or early 20s. That's the most common time to come to faith. In fact, in the UK, there was a survey done recently showing it's actually the first year of university is one of the very common times for people to come to faith. Now, many people don't realize that, and that sparks a whole conversation. Oh, I assumed you'd grown up in the church. Well, actually, no, I didn't grow up in the church. Somebody might say, I came to faith in my university years. So the point is, when you start having those conversations, it can shatter misconceptions and make it a far more interesting conversation.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes we can disqualify people like non-Christians can disqualify Christians just thinking, "Oh, you've always been in the church, you've always been a perfect little Christian." But at the heart of it, like I've met so many beautiful people that have walked really difficult roads and found faith and found a relationship with Christ. I've also walked with a lot of beautiful people that have grown up in the church and have had to wrestle through like, okay, well, what does salvation mean for me? Like you alluded to earlier with your parents' religion, holding onto the coattails and having to make that decision. Is this for me? Do I want to pursue this? And having to make that decision to pursue Christ for yourself, not just because that's how you were raised.
Yeah, I think you're right. So all this comes back to the more we can encourage people who are Christians and those who are not to have kind of conversations where they listen to one another. I think amazing things can happen. And by the way, and again, I'll be very careful and not just doing what I just described a moment ago of making assumptions about everybody. one of the themes I have noticed when I come across people who are wrestling with holding on to their faith or deconstruction or all of those things, there is a theme I do see when they've encountered Christians who haven't been willing to listen. It's not the only cause, but I have come across, quite a few young adults who, ended up in a church where they had a perfectly valid question, and that perfectly valid question was mishandled or even ignored. And then that causes all kinds of problems down the line. So I think for Christians listening to this, and any Christian leaders listening to this, making sure that our Christian communities are places where we say no, questions are absolutely welcome. If you're a Christian with a question, you need to ask it. And if you're an outsider, or you call yourself an outsider with a question, please, our doors are open. We should be people who welcome questions, because that's what Jesus did.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. With Apologetics Canada, I've been helping the last few years with a program or a thing called Questioning Christianity. And so we open up the space and time for Christians, non-Christians, whoever has questions about the big things of Christianity, then they can come and ask those questions. And Andy Steiger is one of the leaders for that, and he responds to them. And it's been a beautiful opportunity, even for me, being a table leader, of just listening to the questions that people have. And because I've been there for multiple years, it's like the same questions are being asked. A lot of people are wrestling with the same questions. And so it's been an eye opener for me in that. But I'm also like you said, like for the church, for the congregations within the church, if people come to you and have questions and you don't have answers, like not just saying something to like stop the person from asking the question or dismissing it, but allowing yourself to be available to walk with them in that question. If you don't have an answer, maybe, trying to connect with somebody else that has an answer, or encouraging them to continue to ask those questions, even though you don't have the answer.
I think so. And I think actually, by the way, it's interesting you say that, Melanie, the fear of not having an answer, I think, is something that puts a lot of Christians off. I know when I was a younger Christian and I was in the secular workplace, my first job, I worked for the UK Health Service for kind of some years, and I was terrified about being asked questions to which I don't know the answer. And it took a while to actually realize, the light bulb moment for me was realizing that if somebody asks you a question you don't know the answer to, it's perfectly valid to say, that's a really good question, I don't know the answer to it, but I'll tell you what, tell me, well, firstly, tell me why you ask it and what it means to you. And then secondly, say, would you leave it with me? And I'll go and do my best to find the answer. And then, read a book, do an internet search, talk to an older, wiser Christian. And even better, by the way, if you could even say to them, actually, since then, I think I'd modify that advice by saying the other thing, say to them as well, what about we look into it together? Why don't we sit down together and try and wrestle it through? Because I'm sure there is an answer. Because Christian faith has been around for 2,000 years, which means most questions have been answered. But I confess I don't know the answer, but this could be really interesting. Are you interested? Now, they might laugh you off, but if they're genuine, you've just taken their question very, very seriously and stepped into it rather than push them away. So actually, not knowing the answer to the question can be an amazing opportunity to build a relationship and go deeper and help them. So it's a three-way win.
Yeah. And even like you mentioned before, with the young people that you've encountered where their questions weren't taken seriously, I can look back over my life and I can think of very impactful moments where people did take my questions seriously. And that was a tremendous, that had depth for me, that had meaning for me. That is something that I cherish today, knowing that that person was willing to step into that space for that time. Not that I got what I needed at that time, but it's just that fact that they were present in a season of wrestling and questions. Because I think that a lot of time we can try to stuff down our questions or our wrestlings because we are fearful of how people will react or respond. And so, we don't necessarily have all the answers, but just being present in that moment and allowing people to come as they are, just as Jesus would allow people to come as they are, but also bringing in the truth in that moment and helping people to dig deeper into Christ instead of fall away.
And that fear thing you've touched on there, I think is a really important angle, actually, Melanie, because I think it crops up in two places. I think we've talked a bit about within the church. Christians can be afraid of, oh gosh, what if I don't know the answer to this? Will this, does this prove Christianity's got a problem? Am I stupid? All those kind of things. So we can have fears. But then over the years, I've discovered, I think, outside the church, it's getting a little bit better actually as culture opens up. But, particularly when culture has been very secular. And right now, studies are sort of showing that, people aged 25 and under are much more open to spirituality than people aged 25 and older. So there's a lot of secularism still around. I've come across people who are not Christians, but feel stupid for wanting to ask spiritual questions. I've come across that quite a lot. People have told me stories. They've raised a sort of semi-spiritual question, and someone in their circle has gone, "Oh, don't be so stupid." The other month I was doing an event at a cafe in Scotland, at a big city in Scotland near the university, and actually we did a talk and a Q&A. But actually, I got talking after one of the bar staff who turned out to be a university student who was working the bar in the evenings, and his story was fascinating. He's not Christian, but he said to me, "So this is the third Christian event I found myself in the last 6 weeks accidentally," which I thought was a lovely line. But then I got his backstory. He'd grown up in an atheist home, where basically he said words to the effect of, "My mum and dad had dismissed, we were not encouraged, actively not encouraged to talk about spiritual things." And I thought, well, that's interesting. That's the other side. There can be a stereotype that all Christians brainwash people. They don't like to ask questions. Oh no, it works on both sides too. And so it may be that you're listening to this, or people, who are, in that kind of spiritually searching camp, or would like to be, but feel a bit afraid. Are my mates at work going to laugh at me? Is my spouse going to, think I'm an idiot because perhaps I want to go to church and see what it's all about? So yeah, I think we live in a culture here in Europe and in Canada and North America where actually for a long time it's been quite tricky to admit that you have questions both inside the Christian community and outside it. So again, all we can do to break those barriers down and again say Jesus welcomed questions. You're not stupid for wanting to ask a question, whether you're outside or inside.
Yeah, I like that. That's good. Well, Andy, we're getting close to the end of our time together. So I just wanted to ask if you have anything that you would like to share with our listeners, any encouragement, any even resources or any final words.
Yeah, well, in terms of resources, the blatant plug you've already done, which is the Have You Ever Wondered book, which, by the way, we should have said that there are 10 different authors in that book, 10 different women and men who've contributed to that book. And one of the contributors is Apologetics Canada's Andy Steiger, wrote, I think, one, possibly two, I think definitely one chapter in there. So really encourage you, if you are spiritually searching, take a look at it. If you have friends who are kind of take a look at it. You can get it online from the publisher, 10 of those, dirt cheap. It's a really handy resource. And then my encouragement to people would be to pursue the questions. So if you're a Christian listening to this, learn to listen to questions. Learn to slow down. Be praying. Be praying. God, would you bring to my attention the questions that my friends are asking? Maybe even cause them to ask me a question. But lean in. And if you're someone listening to this who is wrestling or searching or seeking, the wandering questions that we started with, begin thinking about some of those big questions. Have you wondered why justice matters, why beauty moves us, why we long for love, why we all know that life is about more than just the stuff that we own? But have you wondered where those clues are heading? Because I would, my lived experience of 40 years of following Christ is those are all threads that ultimately head to Christ. It may take you a while to get there. I'm not telling you just jump and just take that blind leap of faith. Although sometimes blind leaps of faith end up in interesting places. But don't just sit there. Follow the threads, ask the questions, and as you do, maybe pray. God, I don't know what I think about you, but I do want to know what's true. So would you guide me into truth at the speed that you would have me go?
Yeah, that's good. Awesome. Thanks again, Andy.
Thanks, Melanie. It's been a pleasure.
Well, listeners, thanks again for tuning in to this week's episode of Rekindled Faith. Be sure to check out the show notes to see different resources and be able to connect with the work that Dr. Andy Bannister is up to. And as always, please consider liking, commenting, subscribing, leaving a review, all of those things for Rekindled Faith so that we can help encourage, uplift, and inspire the rising generations to seek out the heart of Christ in a time such as this. Thanks again for tuning in. Bye for now.